Hello, everyone. Today I have Steve Kaufmann here, who is from Vancouver and speaks just about 20 languages. Is that the right number?
Yeah, with varying degrees of fluency, of course.
What would you say your top 5 to 10 languages are?
Yeah, going in order, and it's kind of hard. Some, you're better at in some aspects of the language, but generally speaking, I would say obviously English, French, followed by Japanese, Mandarin, Spanish, and then maybe Swedish. And then it's kind of close, German, Russian, Italian, Cantonese. Portuguese is in there. Those are the ones, even Ukrainian, that I can turn on. Then right now, my Arabic is not so bad because I'm focused on Arabic right now. But then Korean even is not so bad. But then languages that I learned for a while and went to the country and used, but then haven't practiced since, like Greek or Romanian, Czech, then I would struggle a bit. But they're there. They'll come back. I'm never afraid of losing my languages.
That's actually one of my questions is, do you ever, go through periods where you don't use a particular language and then notice yourself becoming rusty because you haven't used it for a while?
Yeah, it all depends on the level you have. If you are at a certain level, like I would say my top 10 languages, I'm not going to lose very much. I'll forget the odd word, make more mistakes than normal because, when we're speaking the language, we're influenced by the people we're speaking with. And so they start using the language correctly and we pick up on that and we're reminded of it. But I won't really fall back very far. Whereas languages where I didn't really get past that sort of critical mass, then there's more slippage. So I would really struggle to say much, but it wouldn't take me a day to get back pretty close to where I was. So it's never a concern. You can't possibly maintain 20 languages. I can't be speaking in 20 languages every day. It's just not possible.
When you first became interested in learning languages, was it was Chinese first or Japanese first?
Well, actually, my first love, so to speak, was French. So we had French at school. I couldn't really say much in French. And then I got really turned on. There was, La Nouvelle Vague, the movies in the 60s. And I ended up going to France. I spent 3 years there. And I have very fond feelings for French and for France and the whole works. But then the next one was Chinese, Mandarin Chinese, then followed by Japanese.
Chinese was one of my first languages that I really fell in love with, but sort of as a concept, because when I was younger, I never really put in the work to learn it. So one of my questions is, what methods did you use when you first started learning languages, and how have those methods changed over the years?
I would say that there are minor changes for certain languages, but by and large, it's been the same. In other words, when I was at school learning French, I passed my exams. I did well in French. I couldn't say much. I wasn't very interested. The minute I became motivated and I did a lot of reading and watching movies and listening, then the language took off, all by itself. When I was learning Chinese, of course, the thing you have to do for Chinese, you have to make a sort of dedicated effort to learn the characters. So that's somewhat unique to Chinese. However, my main activity was listening and reading. And this was long before I had ever heard of Stephen Krashen and the input, based approach to language learning. It just struck me that if I could just keep on devouring content, devouring words, some would eventually stick. More and more would stick. And if I listened and listened and listened, the brain became more and more accustomed to the language. So other than the fact that I have a more refined way of explaining it today because I've read Stephen Krashen, but the essential way of learning hasn't changed.
And would you say that, in varying levels of difficulty, of course, English being your native language, what languages would you say were the easiest for you for that to happen? And then what kind of were the most difficult?
For an English speaker, the Romance languages are relatively easy because 50% of the vocabulary is recognizable.
Right.
Spanish is easier than French because it's written the way it's pronounced. So Spanish would be the easiest language to pick up, I would think. Then you get, into the German, which is a little more complicated in terms of grammar, and the more Germanic words, which you recognize some of them, but fewer sort of French type words there. And then when you get further afield, like into Chinese and Arabic, then it becomes much, much more difficult.
I'm currently diving back into Spanish. I learned Spanish for 4 years in high school, and I feel like I just had an epiphany recently that
Okay.
listening and reading are a big part of learning a language, which of course sounds so, common sense. But in my mind, I had always felt that I needed to take a class, or I needed to be in a classroom setting to learn a language. And I realize now that that is not the case.
I wouldn't say it's necessarily logical. People don't realize it. But the brain is this pattern forming machine. That's what the brain does. It deals with all kinds of stimulus and experience in life, and it forms little patterns so that as you encounter the same experience the second, third, and fourth time, you're able to function, right? That's what the brain does. Trust the brain. Give it enough stimulus in the language, it'll start sorting things out. If, on the other hand, you say to the brain, here's this rule, try to remember the rule, and then here's this test to see if you understood the rule, that is hopeless. The brain can't do that. So to me, the idea that we learn languages primarily through listening and reading, Stephen Krashen's input hypothesis, is absolutely normal, natural, but most people don't realize it. They think they have to speak their way to fluency and take classes and study grammar and do tests.
Yeah.
Nothing could be further from the truth.
What would you say are some other misconceptions about language learning?
Oh, but there's lots. I think one of the ideas, and I think good language learners recognize that they're going to continue to make mistakes. They're going to continue to forget things. There is no mastering the basics. It's not because you studied something that was in chapter 2 that you're going to learn it. Whatever rule was introduced in chapter 2 may not click in until 6 months later. So that's a myth. The other thing is we are constantly noticing things in the language, something that the teacher very proudly taught us and we didn't, twig to. We'll suddenly notice it for whatever reason. Maybe we'll remember what the teacher said, or maybe we've just seen it so often. And so gradually we start to notice these things. But the myth is that somehow you can deliberately learn something, or you can deliberately teach something, or you can try and master it, and that you have these building blocks in the language. I think all of that is no. And therefore not to be too hard on yourself when you forget over and over and over again.
Would you say that learning more than one language at a time is feasible, advisable?
Well, I used to say no. I used to say only study one. Then the last couple of years I've been sort of playing around, mostly with Arabic, some Farsi, and some Persian, that is, and some Turkish. I mean, it's better to focus on one because then you're spending more time on the one. But if my eventual goal is to learn all three of those Middle Eastern languages, then 3 months on one, 3 months on another is not bad either, because then I don't sort of drift back too far in the one. It also introduces an element of variety, and variety is always good in learning anything. The more you focus just on one thing, there is a certain law of diminishing returns that kicks in. So a little tired of Arabic, I'll switch to Persian. Although right now I'm on a 90-day challenge at Link, so I'm staying with Arabic, but I kind of miss my Persian. So the simple answer is, if you're a dilettante like me, that's not a problem. If you need to learn the language for work or for whatever, or for school, then you better stay on one.
And I guess it's important or easier if the languages are further away on different branches.
I'm not sure of that. That's possible. I just haven't seen that proven anywhere.
Gotcha.
It helps actually, because there's about a 15% vocabulary overlap between Persian, Arabic, and Turkish. It actually helps. Now you've got 15% of words that you're going to remember more easily. If you're learning Portuguese and Spanish, you might be a bit confused, but on the other hand, you've got all the vocabulary because it's not like 90% the same words. So I think they're compensations. I'm not convinced. I haven't seen the proof that it's harder to do them if they're similar. I don't know that that's true.
Have you ever learned a language through another language, or is it always English?
Basically, I try to stay in the language. So I'm reading content, I'm listening to content. The only time I'm in another language is the dictionary. And typically I prefer the dictionary in English or French for that matter, because it's the same. I know both those languages sufficiently well that it wouldn't be a problem. If I had a dictionary that went to a language that I wasn't so familiar with, then it creates the possibility that I'll get a definition that I still don't understand, right? So these people who use monolingual dictionaries, they look up a word they don't know and they get an explanation with a bunch of words they don't know. So I'm not a big fan of that, but I don't really see myself learning the language through a language. I think at a certain point, if you want to get really good in your grammar, you may want to read a grammar book written in the target language for that matter, because then you're sort of in the target language, but it's not something you can do at the beginning. So at the beginning, yeah, your explanations of what's going on, to the extent that you need them, should be in a language that you're quite familiar with, but whether that has to be English or French or whatever, it depends on the person.
At the beginning, when you're first, you have no experience in a language, how do you start off? What do you focus on at the very beginning before you get into the reading?
Right. It used to be that I would start with a typical starter book, like Teach Yourself or Colloquial or one of those, Simil or whatever it might be. And they introduce certain grammatical concepts in each chapter. They introduce a simple dialogue. You're at the train station or you're going through customs. I don't know why they always have people going through customs. You're unlikely to use your target language going through customs. So it used to be that, but now I found at Link, because we have these mini stories where they're deliberately designed to have a lot of repetition built into them, and they're based on the most frequent verbs in the language. So if I listen to those, and there's 60 of them, so I go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, back to 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I end up listening to them 30, 40 times, and that really tends to drive the basic structures of the language into my brain. And then I will still, though, get a Teach Yourself or one of those starter books and occasionally flip through it, and you'll see some explanations, because some things you notice in the language, some things the brain sort of starts to create some patterns, some things you're not entirely clear, like why do they do it that way? And so then it's useful after you've had that exposure to the language to read up some explanations. But it is surprising how with those mini stories, when you listen to it for the first time and there's text, and I'm looking at words at Link, so it's an online dictionary, that at first it's just noise. And yet within 2 months, what was once just noise is now meaning. And I've done it over and over again, and it's kind of fun to see that happen.
I also love the highlight where it shows you your known words. I find that if I forget a word and I have to look to see what it is again, I'm more likely to remember it the next time because I've just failed. And so I feel like, the embarrassment of being wrong kind of makes me remember it the next time.
I mean, it's frustrating. I know in Link of all these yellow words that I have met maybe several times before, and every time I see them, I don't know what they mean. But what I do, I try to move them manually to status 3, which is like I almost know them, right? And then I'll go into the vocab section, and I'll just put the filter to just status 3 words. So now I've got a bunch of words, pages and pages of words that I'm close to being able to know. And I go through there and I do find a lot of words that I know. And that's where I move a lot of them to known. But even if later on I don't know it anymore, it slips back, I just move it back to status 3. Mostly I'm picking these words up in context as I'm reading and listening.
You would say the most important thing is reading and listening just over and over and spending time with the language.
Exactly. In that initial period, as I mentioned with the mini stories, I tend to go over them many, many times. And then as you progress, of course, you're going to go over the same story less often because you understand it now. And you're more motivated to get at interesting stuff. Like right now, I get these podcasts from Al Jazeera. They're talking about political events in the Middle East. So I'm motivated to find out what's going on. I don't want to listen to that same thing over and over again. So our tolerance for repetition is far greater at the beginning when we're discovering the language. Once we're past a certain point, we're more interested in the actual content itself. And we're sort of growing in the language because we're consuming things that are of interest to us. And of course we want to speak. Now I've started speaking with my Arabic tutor, really nice guy, Mohammed, out of Cairo or near Giza in Egypt. But I don't want to do too much of that because it takes away from my, acquiring the words and the phrases. And the thing about listening to it's so easy to do. You can do it anytime, anywhere. If I have dedicated studying time, I'm going to read. Always, because it's better for vocabulary accumulation.
While you're reading, do you, if you encounter a word that you don't know, do you kind of just try to determine what that is through context, or?
No, if I like, unless I'm very good in a language, I won't read paper book, like a traditional book. If I'm reading in a traditional book, let's say in Polish, I'll just let it go. If I don't know the word, I don't know the word. I'm not going to look it up because I know I'll forget whatever I look up. And so it's just not worth the effort. If I'm reading on Link, I'll save the word. So anything I'm reading on Link, I will look up every word. I will look up every yellow word again. If I have even the slightest doubt about the meaning, I look it up again because it reinforces what that is. I don't try and guess at things because very often you're going to guess wrong. And so it will reinforce the wrong meaning. I don't want to do that. I want to get hit with it again.
I feel like that I know the answer already, but do you have any tips for retention other than just repetition? And
I mean, initially you have to get a toehold in the language. So that's kind of the repetitive listening to mini stories. And thereafter, my focus is on just consuming more content. I know that my known words total is going up. And now that I'm in the challenge, I try to deliberately increase my known words. But mostly I'm just enjoying the language. I'm listening. Something comes in. It has to do with events in Sudan or events in Qatar or Lebanon or whatever. I'm just in it. And I know from experience that consuming, when I was studying Chinese, there were books where they talked about events in China in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, all in Chinese. And I'm just learning about what happened in China, and my word count is growing. So I don't make any deliberate effort because it's boring to do that. Like all these people who do their SRS, their Anki, it's no fun to be doing that. And I'm not convinced that it's that effective. So you end up spending a lot of time reviewing all these words. You've spent an hour now. You haven't learned anything about China in the 1920s. It's not clear to me that I've necessarily nailed anything. So I'm not a big fan of doing that. But some people do like doing that. So to each his or her own,
I don't think I'm a flashcards person necessarily. What I've been doing is reading the mini stories, using the mini stories on Link, a couple of Spanish books that I picked up, and a workbook.
The more you can introduce variety, the better. I think the brain wants variety, novelty, different. You can't just sit there and focus on the one thing. So I think you're doing the absolute right thing. I like to get a book as well, like not just be in front of my iPad the whole time, but have actually a paper book and be reading there. But I won't look words up, but at least it's a different experience. And so I think the brain likes to kind of wander around and do different things.
Maybe I didn't realize how little we give our brains credit for, because before I really got back into learning languages seriously, it felt daunting. It's like imagining learning an entire language at once feels daunting.
You're right.
Until you realize that it's just piece by piece, bit by bit, spending time with the language and letting your brain absorb it.
I mean, it's like everything. If you get, you get the manual of how to do something and you haven't done it before, it's daunting. Once you've done it a few times, you've got some habits. It's no big deal. And then you go to some of the more sophisticated areas of the instruction book and you do some more sophisticated things. But it's more in the doing of it, or in the listening and the reading, you acquire a certain, familiarity with the subject. So that's how you got to do it, bit by bit, not try to master it up front or master the basics or any of that stuff.
So right now you're focusing on Arabic. You're in your 90-day challenge of Arabic. That is your focus now, but are there any languages that you think, once I get to a decent level in Arabic, I want to get to this one or that one?
Once you discover that it takes time to learn a language.
Right.
It's not difficult, but it takes time. It takes a year, 2 years, depending on the language. But I know I can achieve it. And at every step along the way, it's fun discovering the language. I know a little bit about Turkish. Even the little bit that I know is fun for me. So I enjoy exploring. So I think right now I'll probably stay focused on the Middle East, Turkish, Arabic, Persian. I might then move along towards the Indian subcontinent with Urdu and Hindi, which we're going to hopefully have at Link in another 3-4 months or so. But, we're going to be adding languages. It's fun to explore. Tagalog, Vietnamese, even to some extent just to dabble in some of these languages just to see what they're all about. You don't have to take every language up to, total fluency. Typically, my goal has been that sort of what in the European framework is called B2, which is kind of where I can understand podcasts and stuff. But it's also fun just to get a bit of a smattering, a taste of a language. So I don't know. It's there for me. Unlimited number of languages that I can dabble in.
I guess I have one final question just for anyone watching this video who might think that they are incapable of learning a language. What would you say to those people?
Well, there are so many people who follow my YouTube channel who tell me that they were told at school or they had the impression that they couldn't learn languages. And because the way they teach languages at school is backwards. They try to give you all the rules before you have any sense of the language. I think anyone can learn. We all learn this more or less the same way. Like you hear all this stuff about I'm a visual learner or a kinetic learner. That's not true. All of our brains function more or less the same way. We require a lot of stimulus and we can all learn in this way. Some people are a little more inhibited at speaking. Some people may pronounce better. Some people may remember certain things better, may notice better, but overwhelmingly, that's not the main difference. The main difference is our attitude. And that's why if you go to certain countries, a lot of people speak foreign languages well. And if you go to other countries, they don't. And it's not because Sweden has a gene for learning languages. It's because they're exposed to the language on television. Lots of programs are in English and stuff. So to the extent that we expose ourselves to the language in an intelligent way, we can all learn. And at any age.
Amazing. Completely agree. Thank you so much for coming on my channel.
Happy to talk to you.
Please check out Link and Steve's YouTube channel. The links are in the description box.
Super. Thank you very much. Really enjoyed it.